The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses. It was the kind of place where people came to unwind, to enjoy a good meal, and for some, to celebrate life's successes. Dr. Marcus Reynolds sat at his table, dressed sharply in his white coat, his stethoscope still draped around his neck, a clear sign of the long shift he had just finished at the hospital. He had barely taken his first bite when the atmosphere around him suddenly shifted. Two police officers entered, their eyes scanning the room until they locked onto him. Their expressions hardened as they approached his table, their presence commanding attention. Conversations hushed, and people turned to watch, sensing something was about to happen. Marcus looked up, confused at first, but the moment one officer rested a hand on his shoulder, he knew this wasn't just a casual inquiry. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the officer said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. Marcus blinked, glancing around as murmurs spread through the restaurant. "I'm sorry, but what is this about?" His voice remained calm, though a knot of unease was already forming in his chest. The second officer crossed his arms. "We got a call about a suspicious individual matching your description. We need to ask you some questions." A quiet chuckle escaped Marcus, though there was no humor in it. He had heard this before. A suspicious individual? He glanced down at himself, still in his doctor's coat. "You mean a man having dinner after saving lives all day?" But the officers weren't interested in explanations. People whispered behind their hands, some recording on their phones, others simply watching in stunned silence. The tension grew thicker by the second. Marcus could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken judgment filling the air. Then, just as one officer reached for his arm, about to escalate the situation further, a voice rang out from across the restaurant, one that made everyone freeze. And in that moment, everything changed. The officer standing by the driver's side window tapped his fingers against the car door, his expression unreadable. His partner stood a few feet behind, arms crossed, watching the interaction closely. The woman in the driver's seat remained calm, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in her side mirror, but she didn't flinch. She had seen this situation play out too many times before, just never with her in the driver's seat. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone firm but not aggressive. She didn't move right away. Instead, she took a slow breath and turned to face him. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" Her voice was steady, professional. The officer hesitated, just for a second, before covering it up with a shrug. "Routine check," he said, but something about the way he said it lacked conviction. A routine check at this hour, in this neighborhood. She wasn't buying it. And neither were the people inside the nearby diner who had started watching through the windows. A few even had their phones out, recording. She noticed but didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she reached for her purse slowly and pulled out her wallet, flipping it open to reveal her ID. The officer took it, glancing at it without much thought at first, until his eyes locked onto the name. His brows furrowed, lips parting slightly as he read it again. Then suddenly his body stiffened. His partner, noticing the change, stepped forward. "What's the holdup?" he asked. The first officer cleared his throat, but there was a sudden shift in his demeanor. The confidence, the authority he had been projecting moments ago, seemed to waver. His eyes flickered from the ID to the woman's face, then back again. "Everything okay?" the woman asked, tilting her head slightly. The second officer snatched the ID from his partner's hands, impatiently scanning it himself. As soon as he saw the name, his entire expression changed. His mouth tightened, and his gaze snapped back to the woman. The silence stretched between them, thick with realization. They had just pulled over their new boss. The officer holding the ID swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edges like he wasn't sure whether to hand it back or keep staring at it. His partner shifted uncomfortably, his stance no longer as rigid as before. The woman in the driver's seat remained calm, but her eyes held an undeniable sharpness, one that saw everything, every nervous glance, every faltering breath. A light breeze carried the distant hum of traffic, but the tension between them made it feel like the whole street had gone silent. Inside the diner, more people had their phones out now, whispering among themselves. A few had even stepped outside, inching closer, sensing that something unusual was happening. The officer who had initially pulled her over cleared his throat. Chief." The word came out awkwardly, like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. This was just a routine stop, nothing personal. She raised an eyebrow. A routine stop? In my own division? The way she said it made his partner flinch. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that when someone repeats your excuse back to you, it usually means they don't believe a word of it. "We weren't targeting you," the second officer added quickly, as if trying to regain control of the situation. We just didn't recognize the vehicle." The chief of police took a slow breath, drumming her fingers lightly against the steering wheel. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. This wasn't just about her. It was about every unnecessary stop, every excuse used to justify an action that shouldn't have happened in the first place. She knew these officers, had seen their records, their evaluations. Neither of them had a history of misconduct, but that didn't mean they were free of bias. She glanced at their badges, noting their names. Then finally, she reached out and took her ID back, slipping it into her wallet with deliberate slowness. "Tell me something," she said, her voice measured. "If I wasn't the chief, how would this have ended?" Neither officer answered. They didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. The officers exchanged glances, their once confident demeanor now replaced by something closer to unease. The chief's question hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The younger officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. The other officer, the one who had pulled her over in the first place, cleared his throat again, as if hoping the sound would break the silence. It didn't. The chief of police didn't rush them. She just watched, waiting. She knew they were running through every possible response in their heads, trying to find the safest way out. But there wasn't one. Not this time. Inside the diner, people had stopped pretending to mind their business. A few had even stepped onto the sidewalk, their phones held higher now. This wasn't just a minor traffic stop anymore. It was something bigger. The tension, the shift in power, the way the officers now carried themselves differently, all of it was playing out in real time, and everyone could feel it. One of the officers finally spoke. "Look, Chief, But before he could finish, another voice cut through the scene. "Everything okay here?" A man in a crisp suit had appeared near the edge of the crowd, walking toward them with purpose. His badge flashed as he moved, and the moment the officers saw it, their expressions tightened. Internal affairs. The chief didn't react right away. She kept her eyes on the officers, noting the way their shoulders squared up, their jaws clenched. They knew what this meant. They knew the situation had just escalated beyond their control. The IA investigator stopped beside her, his gaze flicking from her to the officers. "I got a call," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sounds like something I should be looking into." The officers straightened, their composure slipping. This wasn't just about an awkward misunderstanding anymore. It was about accountability, about consequences. The chief exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. She had expected a reaction, but she hadn't expected things to take this turn so quickly. Now, with internal affairs involved, everything was about to come to a head. The two officers stiffened as the internal affairs investigator stepped closer, his eyes scanning their faces with quiet scrutiny. The chief remained still, her expression unreadable, though she could feel the shift in energy around her. The moment had changed. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was about something much bigger. Before anyone could speak, a voice crackled over the police radio, clipped to one of the officers' belts. All units be advised, priority alert. Suspect fleeing scene of a robbery near 5th and Main. Description matches the message cut off as the officer hastily turned down the volume, but it was too late. The crowd had heard it, and so had the chief. Her eyes locked onto the officers, her mind working quickly. She had read this play before. A sudden high-priority call, conveniently timed, meant one thing: they were looking for a way out. A distraction. An excuse to walk away before things got worse for them. The younger officer latched onto the opportunity immediately. "We should go," he said to his partner, his voice tight. "That's an active situation." The internal affairs investigator folded his arms. "You're not going anywhere." The crowd murmured, shifting closer. The chief could see the hesitation in the officer's eyes now, the way they were torn between their instincts to follow orders and their desire to escape scrutiny. The weight of the situation was pressing down on them, suffocating. Then, just when it seemed like they would be forced to face the consequences of their actions, something unexpected happened. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows rolling down smoothly. The man inside, wearing an expensive suit and dark sunglasses, leaned out just enough for the chief to see his face. Her stomach tightened. She knew exactly who he was. "Chief," he said, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken. "Get in." The officers stiffened. The IA investigator frowned. The crowd went silent. And just like that, the situation had changed again. The chief didn't move right away. Her eyes flicked from the man in the car to the two officers still standing stiffly beside her. She could see the confusion in their faces, the growing unease. They were trying to figure out who this man was, why he carried himself with such authority. But the chief already knew. The internal affairs investigator stepped forward. "Chief, who is this?" His tone was cautious, but his eyes held curiosity. The man in the car smirked slightly, then turned his attention to the officers. "These two," he said, nodding toward them, "are they the ones who stopped you?" The chief exhaled slowly. "Yes." The officers' faces paled. One of them instinctively reached for his radio, but the man in the car shook his head. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone sensing that something huge was unfolding in front of them. Then the man in the car finally introduced himself.